There is a particular kind of silence that exists only between 3 and 4 in the morning. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a world that has forgotten you are still awake, still working, still watching, still carrying something no one else wanted to carry. It is the silence of fluorescent lights humming over empty desks, of coffee gone cold in a paper cup, of a man staring at numbers on a screen while everyone who matters to the people who hired him sleeps in apartments with views of a harbor that shimmers like scattered diamonds. Elias knew this silence the way other men know the sound of their own heartbeat. He had worked inside it for 11 years. He was 43 years old. He wore the same 3 button-down shirts in rotation: pale blue, gray, and a white one he saved for Mondays because Mondays felt like they deserved something. His hair had gone silver at the temples somewhere in his late 30s, and he hadn't noticed until his daughter pointed it out during a video call, laughing the way children laugh when they discover something wonderful about the people they love. "Baba," she had said, leaning close to the camera. "You look like a wolf now." He had laughed too. That was 14 months ago, before the diagnosis, before the medical bills began arriving like a tide that never pulled back. His name was Elias Tan Wei Ming, and he was the senior night auditor for Meridian Pacific Investment Bank, one of the 12 largest financial institutions in Southeast Asia, with total assets exceeding $240 billion in operations spanning 41 countries. He had the title of senior auditor, but the visibility of furniture. He sat in the basement-adjacent annex of the 43rd floor, a partitioned corner that the daytime staff called, without any particular cruelty, the cave. He had a desk, 2 monitors, a telephone that almost never rang, and a window that faced the air conditioning infrastructure of the building next door. He did not complain about this. What Elias did every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. was watch. He watched transaction flows across 17 different interbank systems. He watched liquidity ratios, settlement queues, reconciliation ledgers, and the quiet mechanical heartbeat of automated trading algorithms processing millions of microtransactions while the world slept. Most nights, nothing happened. The algorithms were elegant and self-correcting. The systems had redundancies layered over redundancies. The compliance teams had checked everything. The risk committees had signed everything. Everything was, by every reasonable measure, fine. But Elias had learned over 11 years of listening to this particular silence that fine and safe were not the same thing. He had caught 14 discrepancy events in his tenure. 12 of them were minor: clerical mismatches, settlement timing errors, the occasional ghost transaction that surfaced from a legacy system nobody had fully decommissioned. One of them, in 2019, had been a rounding exploitation in a derivatives processing module that could have cost the bank approximately $40 million if left uncorrected. He had flagged it at 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday. The compliance team had thanked him in an email with 17 recipients, none of whom were executives. The 14th anomaly was different. He had been watching it for 3 weeks before anyone else knew it existed. Let me tell you about the world Elias worked inside because you need to understand what was at stake. Not in abstract financial terms, but in the way it touched ordinary human lives. Meridian Pacific's Singapore headquarters occupied floors 38 through 47 of the Celeste Tower on Marina Bay. The building was designed by a Danish architecture firm and featured a glass facade that turned pink at sunrise and deep violet at dusk. The lobby had a living wall of ferns and orchids that cost more per month to maintain than Elias earned in a year. The executive floors had espresso machines imported from Milan, panoramic windows overlooking the straits, and a private dining room that served a rotating seasonal menu curated by a chef who had trained in Lyon. The bank's CEO as of 8 months prior was a man named Crispin Aldrovandi. Say the name out loud and you can almost hear the weight of it. Crispin Aldrovandi. It sounded like old money and sharp suits, and he was both of those things. He was 51, Italian-born, educated at INSEAD and the London School of Economics, and he had spent the previous decade turning around 2 struggling European investment banks, through what the financial press called surgical restructuring, a phrase that, when you looked closely, usually meant laying off 15% of the workforce while simultaneously raising executive compensation by 30%. He had been profiled in The Economist, photographed for Forbes Asia, and described by a Bloomberg interviewer as the kind of man who makes difficult decisions look inevitable. He was also in the way of many brilliant men who have never been seriously wrong about anything important, utterly dismissive of people he considered beneath the level of strategic thinking. He had a phrase he used in executive meetings, always delivered with the relaxed confidence of a man who has never needed to soften anything he says. The numbers don't lie. People do. He said it like it was wisdom, like it was armor, like it meant something deeper than it actually did. What it meant, really, was that he trusted systems over instincts, automation over intuition, quantitative models over the nagging feeling a tired man in a basement-adjacent office gets at 3 a.m. when a number doesn't sit right. Crispin Aldrovandi had never worked a night shift in his life. The quarterly shareholder transparency stream was Aldrovandi's idea. He had introduced it in his first month as CEO, a live webcast, broadcast to institutional investors and major shareholders across 12 time zones, in which senior leadership presented the bank's performance metrics, strategic initiatives, and risk posture in real time. It was progressive in the way expensive things packaged as openness usually are. It was also, for the people who worked below the 38th floor, a performance, a theater of competence designed for an audience that wanted to feel included in the machine without being asked to understand it. The October stream was scheduled for 9 a.m. Singapore time, which meant 3 a.m. in London, 8 p.m. in New York, and 11 p.m. on the west coast of the United States. 64,000 shareholder accounts would be logged in. The investor relations team had spent 3 weeks preparing the slide deck. Aldrovandi had rehearsed his opening remarks 4 times with a media trainer. Elias was not supposed to be part of it. He had requested, through the proper channels, an email to his direct supervisor, copied to the compliance department head, an opportunity to present his findings before the stream went live. He had asked 3 times over the preceding 10 days. Twice he received automated acknowledgement receipts. The 3rd time, his supervisor, a pleasant but perpetually overwhelmed man named Dennis Fong, had called him on the desk phone and said, with genuine sympathy layered over genuine administrative helplessness, "Elias, I hear you, but the Q3 metrics are already locked. If there were a real issue, the automated systems would have flagged it." "The automated systems," Elias had said carefully, "are part of what I'm flagging." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that means someone is deciding whether to understand you or whether to move on. Dennis moved on, so Elias did something he had never done in 11 years. He showed up at 8:40 a.m. on the 39th floor. He had not slept. He was wearing the white shirt, the Monday shirt, even though it was a Thursday, because he wanted to look like someone who deserved to be heard. He carried a printout, 17 pages of transaction logs, annotated in red pen, cross-referenced with 3 separate interbank data sources. And he asked the executive assistant outside the pre-stream briefing room if he could have 5 minutes. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who manages access for a living, professionally neutral, quietly absolute. "Do you have a calendar appointment?" He did not. "Let me see if Mr. Aldrovandi has a moment after the stream." He stood in the corridor for 40 minutes. The pre-stream briefing ended. Executives filed out in blazers, checking phones, talking over each other in the half-excited way people talk when they are about to perform. Aldrovandi came last, already moving fast, eyes already on the room beyond the next door, 2 assistants angled toward him like satellites. "Mr. Aldrovandi," Elias said. Aldrovandi stopped. He looked at Elias the way a man looks at something slightly out of place. Not with hostility exactly, but with the particular impatience of someone whose time has been pre-allocated down to the minute.
Yes? I'm Elias Tan, Senior Night Auditor, Compliance Annex. I've identified a series of anomalies in the sovereign debt swap settlements, offshore routing patterns that don't match our documented counterparty authorizations. I've been trying to get this in front of Night Auditor. Algervandi repeated it the way you repeat a word in a language you don't speak, just to hear what it sounds like. And you think this is the right moment for this conversation? I've been trying to schedule. Send it to Dennis. Dennis handles your department. And then, already turning, already moving, he said something that Elias would carry in his chest for the next 12 hours like a splinter he couldn't reach. The overnight team see ghosts. It's what happens when you spend too much time alone in the dark. He said it without cruelty. That was the thing. He said it the way you say something you believe to be simply, obviously true. And then he walked into the stream. The live shareholder broadcast had been running for approximately 22 minutes when a producer, caught up in the energy of a large audience and the particular looseness that comes from a stream going well, made a small, catastrophic editorial decision. A shareholder, account registered to an institutional fund in Zurich, had submitted a question through the live portal. There are rumors on financial forums of internal anomaly flags being suppressed. Can leadership comment? It was probably nothing. Forum chatter, the kind of noise that exists in the permanent low hum of financial paranoia online. Algervandi's chief communications officer passed him the question on a tablet. Algervandi read it, and something, perhaps the energy of the room, perhaps the 64,000 viewers, perhaps the particular confidence of a man who has been right so many times that being right has become identity, made him decide to answer it with an example. I'll tell you what happens with those rumors, he said, looking into the camera with the practiced ease of a man who has given 100 interviews. This morning, before this stream, I had a member of our overnight audit team approach me in the corridor, well-meaning, I'm sure, years of service, with a stack of printouts and a theory about invisible anomalies. He smiled. Not a mean smile exactly, the smile of a man illustrating a broader truth. That's what our systems prevent, individual anxiety from becoming institutional paralysis. Our automated oversight infrastructure is the most sophisticated in the region. We don't run this bank on gut feelings at 3 a.m. Light laughter from the people in the room, a ripple of animated emoji in the live comment feed. In the compliance annex on the 43rd floor, Elias sat at his desk, watching the stream on his monitor because he had developed the habit of monitoring all company broadcasts for any financial commentary that might require overnight follow-up. He watched the CEO describe him, without naming him, to 64,000 shareholders. He watched the laughter. He watched the comment feed. He did not move for a very long time. He sat in his chair, the ergonomic one with the cracked armrest that he'd requested be replaced twice, and he looked at the 17-page printout on his desk, and he looked at his secondary monitor where 3 weeks of anomaly data sat in a color-coded spreadsheet that no one had opened except him, and he felt something that was not quite anger, and not quite humiliation, and not quite despair, but that contained all three the way a storm contains separate winds. His phone buzzed. A text from a number with a Malaysian country code, the hospital in Penang where his daughter, Mei Lin, age 9, was waiting for a pediatric cardiac procedure that had been delayed twice already due to funding issues, and which was now rescheduled for the following Monday. The text was from the charge nurse he had befriended over months of phone calls. It said, "She had a good day today. She drew you a picture. I'll send it when I get a chance. Don't worry too much, Dad." He looked at the text for a long time. Then he put his phone face down on the desk, turned back to his monitors, and went back to work. To understand what Elias had found, you need to understand, not in the way a financial analyst understands it, but in the way a story requires you to understand it, how modern global banking actually works at night. The popular imagination of international finance involves trading floors, shouting, suits, ticker tape, the dramatic rise and fall of numbers on massive screens. The reality, in the small hours of the morning, is something closer to a vast, automated nervous system, millions of transactions per hour, processed by algorithms operating across multiple time zones simultaneously, settlements moving between correspondent banks through messaging protocols that are older in their underlying architecture than the internet itself. Sovereign debt swaps are a specific instrument, agreements between large financial institutions to exchange the debt obligations of different national governments, typically used to manage exposure, hedge risk, or, and this is where the architecture gets interesting, to temporarily transfer liquidity across jurisdictions without triggering the reporting thresholds that would attract regulatory scrutiny. They are legal, they are common, they are also, when structured with sufficient creativity across sufficient layers of offshore intermediary entities, nearly invisible to any single oversight system. Meridian Pacific had approximately 430 active sovereign debt swap positions on any given night. The automated monitoring system, a system called Sentinel, introduced 18 months prior as part of Aldravandi's modernization initiative, cross-referenced these positions against a matrix of counterparty authorizations, jurisdictional flags, and settlement timing windows. Sentinel was, by every benchmark the bank's technology team had applied to it, excellent. What Sentinel was not designed to detect was a specific type of recursive settlement loop, a sequence of transactions that, individually, fell within all normal parameters, but which, in aggregate and over time, created a phantom liquidity layer. Notional value that appeared on the bank's books as real settled assets, while the actual underlying sovereign instruments were simultaneously encumbered in a parallel chain of obligations that Sentinel's authorization matrix did not map. It was, to use a physical analogy, as though someone had discovered that you could write the same check twice, once to the visible ledger and once to a shadow one, as long as you did it slowly enough, and through enough intermediaries, and at the right time of night, that no single monitoring system ever saw the complete picture. Elias had not known, when he first noticed it, what he was looking at. He had only known that a particular pattern of settlement timestamps across 3 offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and the Cook Islands, did not match the counterparty authorization codes in Meridian Pacific's own records. Not because the codes were wrong, because they were right in a way that should have been impossible. They matched authorizations that had been decommissioned 14 months earlier during a legacy system migration that the technology team had logged as complete. Authorizations that, technically, no longer existed in the live system, but that were still being processed by it. He had stared at this for approximately 40 minutes the first night he found it, the way you stare at a sentence that seems grammatically correct but means something that cannot be right. Then he had begun, slowly, carefully, to pull the thread. Over 3 weeks, working between 2 and 5 in the morning, when the transaction volumes were at their overnight low and the monitoring systems had the most headroom for manual interrogation, he had mapped what he could only call an architecture within the architecture. A second nervous system, running parallel to the legitimate one, invisible to Sentinel because it was built from Sentinel's own blind spots, from the specific gaps between what the system was designed to monitor and what it was not. He had not, in 3 weeks, been able to determine whether this was an error, a catastrophic legacy integration failure left over from the system migration, or something deliberate. He had not yet been able to calculate the full exposure. He did not have the access level or the processing power, working alone on his 2 monitors in the compliance annex, to run a complete model. What he had calculated, carefully, conservatively, using the transaction patterns he had been able to map, was a minimum plausible exposure figure. That figure was 11.3 billion US dollars. He had written it at the top of page 1 of his 17-page printout in red pen, underlined twice. The CEO had smiled at 64,000 shareholders and called it a gut feeling at 3 in the morning. Elias went home at 6:15 a.m. on the morning of the stream. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Toapayo, not a fashionable neighborhood, but a real one, the kind of Singapore neighborhood where the void decks of HDB blocks shelter elderly uncles playing chess in the afternoon, and the coffee shops open at 5:30, and the air always smells faintly of frangipani and industrial cleaning fluid. He had lived there for 7 years, since his wife Xu Fen had taken their daughter to Penang to be closer to Xu Fen's parents, after the marriage had quietly, without drama, come apart under the weight of 2 people who had grown in different directions and were too exhausted to pretend otherwise.
The divorce had been amicable in the way that only divorces between fundamentally decent people can be. Sad, careful, full of consideration for Mei Lin, and ultimately a kind of grief that he had never fully finished grieving, because grief requires space, and he was always at work. He had a framed photograph on his desk, not the work desk, the one at home, of Mei Lin at age 7, standing on a beach in Langkawi with her shoes in one hand and her face turned toward the horizon with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated joy that looking at it felt like being handed something you knew you didn't deserve. He showered. He ate half a bowl of instant noodles. He lay down on his bed with his shoes still on and stared at the ceiling for a while and tried to decide whether he was angry. He decided he was not angry. Anger was a luxury. Anger required energy he couldn't afford. What he was, lying on his bed at 6:40 a.m., with the sounds of the neighborhood beginning to assemble themselves outside his window, the distant call of a man selling vegetables from a cart, the percussion of a bus door, a child's voice somewhere, was scared. He was scared because he knew what he had found, and he knew that what he had found was still there, still running, still processing through the night while the world slept, and that no one with the authority to stop it believed him enough to look. He set his alarm for 2 p.m. He needed to sleep. He had a shift starting at 10. Before he closed his eyes, he sent one more email, this one directly to the chief risk officer, bypassing his supervisor entirely, with the subject line, Urgent. Potential systemic exposure in sovereign debt swap settlements. Requires immediate review. He attached the spreadsheet. He attached the 17 pages. He wrote 7 sentences in the body of the email, each one precise, without drama, without the vocabulary of fear, because he understood that fear in a formal communication is the fastest way to be dismissed as irrational. He sent it. He watched it leave the outbox. He closed his eyes. His phone buzzed once more before sleep took him. The nurse had sent the picture. Mei Lin had drawn him in blue crayon, a figure with silver hair and a wide smile, standing next to a large building with lots of windows, and above him, in careful 7-year-old block letters, Baba saves the day. He looked at it for a long time. Then the alarm went off, and it was 2 p.m., and he got up and made coffee and went back. The first sign, for the people who were watching the right screens, came at 11:47 p.m. Not an alarm, not a red flag, a hesitation, a fractional second delay in a settlement confirmation from a correspondent bank in Frankfurt that should have processed in under 800 milliseconds, but instead resolved in 1.4 seconds. Sentinel logged it as a latency anomaly, assigned it a severity rating of 2 on a 10-point scale, and filed it in a queue that would be reviewed by the automated morning digest at 7 a.m. Elias saw it at 11:49 because he had set a custom alert on his secondary monitor, one that Sentinel itself had not been programmed to flag, for any settlement confirmation from the 3 offshore entities in his anomaly chain that fell outside a timing window of plus or minus 200 milliseconds. He sat up straight. He had been waiting 3 weeks for something like this. He had not known what form it would take. He had not known if it would happen at all, or whether his entire model was wrong, whether he had been tracing shadows after all, whether the CEO had been right and he was a tired man seeing ghosts. He was not seeing ghosts. He pulled up the full transaction log for the Frankfurt correspondent link. He cross-referenced it against the Cayman entity's settlement queue. He ran a reconciliation check between the Cook Islands intermediary's last 48 hours of confirmations and the authorization matrix he had manually reconstructed over 3 weeks of overnight work. What he saw made him very still. The phantom liquidity layer, the shadow architecture he had been mapping, had begun to self-correct. Not because someone had discovered it and was shutting it down, but because one of the underlying sovereign instruments in the chain, a series of Indonesian government bonds that formed the collateral anchor for a cascade of swap obligations, had been downgraded by a major credit rating agency at market close that evening, and the automated valuation adjustment in Sentinel's legitimate processing layer had rippled into the shadow layer in a way the shadow architecture was not designed to handle. It was beginning to eat itself. And because the shadow layer was invisible to Sentinel, the bank's main monitoring system was not seeing what was happening. It was seeing a normal night. Elias's hands were completely steady. This was something people who knew him sometimes remarked upon, that in moments of genuine crisis, Elias Tan became very, very calm. Not the calm of someone who doesn't understand the danger, the calm of someone who understands it so completely that there is no room left in the body for anything other than function.
He calculated, using the partial map he had, the cascade trajectory. If the self-correction continued at the rate he was observing, the phantom layer would begin to unwind in approximately 4 to 6 hours. As it unwound, the notional assets it had been generating would vanish from the legitimate ledger simultaneously, not gradually, not in a way that looked like a controlled adjustment, but in a series of cascading settlement failures that would arrive, to any external monitoring system, as a sudden, massive, unexplained liquidity gap. The minimum exposure he had calculated, 11.3 billion, had been based on a static snapshot of the shadow layer 3 days ago. The layer had continued to grow since then. His current estimate, rough and terrifying, was between $13 and $16 billion. He picked up his desk phone and called the emergency compliance hotline. It rang 11 times. Then it went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called Dennis Fong's personal mobile. It rang 6 times. Dennis answered, voice thick with sleep, the small and startled voice of a man jerked awake at midnight. Dennis, it's Elias. I need you to wake up the chief risk officer. I need you to do it in the next 10 minutes. This is not a recommendation. The sovereign debt anomalies I've been flagging, they're unwinding. Tonight. Right now. A pause. The specific pause of a man trying to decide, in the first 10 seconds of wakefulness, what category of reality he is dealing with. Elias, it's midnight. Are you... Dennis, $13 billion, minimum. Live cascade event, starting now. A pause of his own. Please. The word please is a strange thing to hear from someone delivering a catastrophe. It reorients you. It reminds you that the person talking is human, is asking rather than demanding, is carrying something real. Dennis was quiet for 3 seconds. I'll call Priya, he said. Priya Subramaniam was the chief risk officer. Stay at your desk. Elias was already at his desk. He had not considered leaving it. Priya Subramaniam arrived at 37 minutes past midnight. She was 50 years old and had the particular bearing of someone who has spent 30 years in risk management. Not fearful, not relaxed, but perpetually calibrated, like an instrument that has been tuned so many times it holds its pitch without effort. She was dressed in a way that suggested she had not been entirely asleep. Slacks, a blouse, no jacket. And she walked into the compliance annex carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that Elias would later describe as professionally reserved fury, which was different from anger and more dangerous than alarm. She had read his emails, all 3 of them, she told him, sitting across from his desk and looking at his screens. She had read them over the past weeks and she admitted without apology or elaboration, placed them in a queue for follow-up review. She had trusted Sentinel. She had trusted the system. She did not say she was sorry. She did not have time to be sorry. Walk me through it, she said. He walked her through it. 22 minutes later, she was on the phone with the bank's head of technology and the overnight Singapore Financial Authority duty contact. Her voice was level. Her sentences were short. She used the word material 4 times, which in the language of financial regulation is a word that means this is real and this is large and this cannot be minimized. At 1:15 a.m., the head of technology, a man named Raymond Chi who had designed the Sentinel architecture, arrived on the 43rd floor looking like someone who has been handed a mirror that shows them something they cannot process. He sat next to Elias and looked at the screens for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "How did you find this?" "The authorization codes," Elias said. "The decommissioned ones. They shouldn't have been active. I kept looking at why they were." Raymond looked at the transaction log. He looked at the shadow architecture map that Elias had built over 3 weeks on his secondary monitor, color-coded, cross-referenced, annotated with timestamps and source citations. He looked at it the way an architect looks at a structural diagram and realizes that a building they designed has been secretly modified from the inside. "The Sentinel migration," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." Raymond sat back in his chair and put his hands over his face. 18 months, he said, to himself more than to anyone.
The migration that had introduced Sentinel had, in the process of decommissioning the legacy authorization systems, created a specific gap in the validation architecture. A gap that someone, or something, had subsequently exploited to build the shadow layer. Whether it was an external actor, a sophisticated cyber financial intrusion, or an internal one, or simply a catastrophic legacy automation error that had compounded itself over a year and a half, was not yet known. What was known was this: it was real, it was active, it was unwinding, and they had perhaps 3 hours before it became visible to external systems in a way that would be impossible to contain. At 1:58 a.m., the Singapore Financial Authority issued an emergency coordination notice to Meridian Pacific's senior compliance team. At 2:12 a.m., the bank's board crisis protocol was activated. At 2:30 a.m., the 43rd trading floor, in which by this point had begun to quietly fill with people who had been called in from their beds, arriving with the specific disheveled urgency of people who have been summoned to something they don't yet fully understand, was placed into information lockdown. No external communications except through approved crisis channels. No market-facing systems to be touched except by designated response personnel. All external trading interfaces suspended pending review. Crispin Aldrovandi arrived at 2:47 a.m. He did not look like a man who had been performing confidence for 64,000 shareholders less than 18 hours earlier. He looked like what he was: a brilliant man confronting the possibility that something had been catastrophically, irrevocably wrong inside the machine he had spent 8 months declaring perfect. He was in a dark suit that he had clearly put on quickly. His tie was not quite centered. He walked onto the 43rd floor and immediately went to the chief risk officer, and what passed between them in the next 6 minutes, Elias did not witness directly because he was on the other side of the floor at his extended workstation, now connected to a second and third monitor that Raymond's team had brought up, running the cascade trajectory model that he had been building since midnight. But he heard, from a colleague who was standing nearby, the specific sound of a man receiving information that reconfigures everything he thought he knew. It was not a loud sound, it was almost silent. The sound of a sharp intake of breath, held for a moment, released. Then Aldrovandi's voice controlled, asking specific questions. How long had this been building? Who had known? What the exposure figure was? Who had found it? And then a silence. And then, where is he? Someone pointed. Elias was looking at his screens. He was aware in the peripheral way of someone focused on something critical that Crispin Aldrovandi had crossed the floor and was standing approximately 2 meters to his left. He did not look up immediately. He finished the calculation he was in the middle of, a reconciliation of the Cook Islands entity's remaining unwind exposure. And then he looked up. Aldrovandi was looking at him with an expression that Elias had never seen on the face of anyone in that building directed at him. It was not pity. It was not professional courtesy. It was something rawer and more real than either of those things. "Tell me what you need," Aldrovandi said. 4 words, plain as stone. Elias looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Full access to the counterparty authorization registry going back 24 months, he said. "Direct line to the MAS liaison. Raymond on site for the architecture questions. And someone needs to get the Jakarta Central Bank on the phone, because the Indonesian bond downgrade is the trigger, and they need to know their sovereign instruments are encumbered in a shadow structure they don't have documentation for." Aldrovandi turned to his chief of staff, who was already holding a phone. "All of it," he said. "Now." What followed was the longest 3 hours of Elias Tan's life. Not the hardest hours. The hardest hour of his life had been sitting in a Penang hospital corridor at 4 a.m, learning that his 9-year-old daughter had a congenital heart defect that would require surgical intervention, and feeling the floor of the world tilt beneath him in a way that no professional crisis could replicate. But the longest. He worked with the specific, total concentration of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally been given enough hands to help hold it. The team around him, Raymond's technical architects, Priya's risk analysts, 2 MAS representatives who had arrived at 3:15 a.m. with the focused efficiency of regulators who have seen financial crises before and know exactly which questions to ask first, moved at his direction with a speed and seriousness that he had never been accorded before. He explained the shadow architecture. He explained the cascade mechanics. He explained how the phantom liquidity layer had been generated, how it connected to the legitimate settlement system, and, critically, how it could potentially be contained before the morning market opened in Tokyo, which was now 3 hours and 40 minutes away. The containment strategy was not simple. It required, in essence, manually unwinding the phantom layer in reverse order, closing the shadow obligations one by one, in precise sequence, using a manual override protocol in the Sentinel system that Raymond had to write partially from scratch while Elias was still talking, because the override for something this specific had never been built, because no one had anticipated that something this specific could exist. It also required something that was, in the larger sense, even harder than the technical problem. It required the Jakarta Central Bank to agree, on a 2-hour notice in the middle of the night, to temporarily quarantine the affected Indonesian government bonds from active trading. A request that touched sovereign financial instruments and required a senior level of diplomatic and financial authority that normally took weeks to coordinate. The MAS liaison, a young woman named Clarissa who could not have been more than 32 and who moved through the crisis with the exact right combination of speed and precision, made that call at 3:20 a.m. She was on the phone for 11 minutes. When she hung up, she looked across the floor at Elias and gave a single nod. The Jakarta Central Bank had agreed to a temporary quarantine. There is a particular quality to the silence on a trading floor during a crisis, distinct from any other kind of professional silence. It is the silence of people who understand exactly what is at stake and who have made a collective, wordless agreement to be equal to it. Monitors illuminate faces, keyboards click in irregular rhythms, coffee cups accumulate. The world outside the floor doesn't know what is happening yet. Morning is still dark. The harbor lights still shimmer through the windows. Elias worked through it. At 3:40 a.m., he identified the root trigger point of the cascade, the specific authorization ghost in the legacy system that had seeded the entire shadow architecture. It was not, as Raymond had feared, a sophisticated external intrusion. It was something almost stranger. An automation script, written during the Sentinel migration by a developer who had since left the bank, designed to preserve certain legacy settlement pathways for a transitional period of 90 days. The script had never been deactivated. For 18 months, it had quietly, obliviously, continued to authorize settlement pathways that the rest of the system had forgotten existed. And in that gap, over time, an exploitative structure had grown the way water grows into cracks. It was not malice, it was entropy, the slow, patient catastrophe of a complex system that no one had watched carefully enough. No one except one man, alone in a basement-adjacent office at 3 in the morning, who had decided that a number that didn't sit right was worth 3 weeks of his time. At 4:18 a.m., Raymond's override protocol was operational. At 4:22 a.m., they began manually unwinding the phantom layer. It took 41 minutes. Elias directed the sequence. Which obligations to close first, in what order, at what settlement values, cross-referencing each step against the cascade model to ensure they were not triggering secondary failures as they collapsed the shadow architecture. He called each step quietly, precisely like a surgeon calling for instruments. Raymond executed. Priya confirmed with the MAS liaison. The risk analysts tracked the legitimate ledger values, watching for the anomalous drops that would signal the phantom values were being correctly absorbed rather than simply disappearing. At 5:03 a.m., the last shadow obligation settled. The phantom liquidity layer closed. The legitimate system's exposed position, the number that represented what the bank had appeared to hold but did not, resolved to 0. The total unwind was clean. No value had escaped into the external system. No correspondent bank had been left with an unconfirmed position. The Indonesian bond quarantine had held. Tokyo markets would open in 40 minutes with no visible trace of what had nearly happened. The room went quiet in a different way. Elias stared at his screens for a long moment. His hands, still steady, rested on the edge of his keyboard. Around him, the other people in the room, the analysts, the technicians, the regulators, the executives, were doing the various things that people do in the aftermath of something catastrophic that was, by the narrowest of margins, averted. exhaling, leaning back, exchanging looks that contained more than professional relief. Raymond Shee sat beside him with his hands over his face again, but this time it was different. This time it was something like a man processing grace. Priya Subramaniam looked at Elias and said simply, "Good work." 2 words. In her language, they were substantial. At 5:20 a.m., while Raymond's team was running verification checks and the MAS liaisons were compiling their emergency incident report, Elias's phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a message from the hospital in Penang, the charge nurse. It said, "Hey, hope the night was okay. May's asking about you. She wants to know if you can call before her procedure Monday." The surgeon confirmed 9 a.m. She's being so brave. He read it twice. He stood up from his workstation for the first time in over 5 hours and walked to the window at the far end of the trading floor. It was the window that faced the harbor. The sky above the straits had begun to turn from black to the deep navy blue that precedes dawn. Not light yet, not the absence of darkness, but something in between. The specific atmospheric moment when night admits that it cannot hold. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes. He thought about Mei Lin drawing him in blue crayon, the silver-haired wolf figure with the wide smile. Baba saves the day. He thought about what it meant to save something. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not in the sense of the word as it appears in headlines and award citations, but in the ordinary, bone-deep sense. The sense that means I saw what was happening. I stayed. I did not stop watching. I did not let myself believe that because no one agreed with me, I must be wrong. He thought about his daughter's heart. The specific, small, perfect heart of a 9-year-old girl who drew pictures in blue crayon and called her father a wolf, beating with a structural fault that a surgeon in Penang was going to correct in 4 days, assuming the money came through. He had been making the payments in installments, rearranging everything, going without things he told himself he didn't need. He was not sure still if it would be enough. He thought about how none of the people who had been in that room tonight, not one of them, had known while he was working that he was also carrying this. That behind the steady hands and the quiet voice and the color-coded spreadsheet was a man who had been spending his nights watching for catastrophe at a global bank, while spending his days afraid of a different kind of catastrophe entirely, one that fit in a hospital room in a city across the water. One that had nothing to do with algorithms or sovereign debt, and everything to do with love. The harbor turned pink. He went back to his desk. Crispin Aldravandi found him there at 6 a.m., just as Elias was beginning his transition documentation. The formal incident record that would need to be completed before he could leave. Aldravandi did not have an assistant with him this time. He pulled a chair from an empty workstation and sat down beside Elias's desk in the way that people sit when they have decided to be human rather than executive. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the screens, the monitors now showing the clean, normal overnight settlement queues of a bank that had, for 41 minutes between 4:22 and 5:03 a.m., been balanced on the edge of something that would have cost countries access to emergency reserves, that would have cascaded through correspondent banking networks in Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and Colombo, that would have potentially triggered liquidity freezes in sovereign debt markets across 3 time zones. "I've been trying to think," Aldravandi said finally, "about what to say to you." Elias waited. "I'm not good at being wrong," Aldravandi said. It came out with the particular effort of a man who says almost nothing from a position of genuine vulnerability. "I've built a career on not being wrong, or on being wrong quickly and quietly and in controlled environments where I can manage the fallout." He paused. This was not that. Elias said nothing. "I said something about you in front of 64,000 people that was dismissive and incorrect and—" He stopped. "I embarrassed you. I used you as an example of the kind of thing my systems were supposed to prevent. And you were the thing my systems had failed to be." The room around them had quieted somewhat. Not silent, and there were still people at workstations, still keyboards, still the low electronic hum of a floor beginning to wind down from crisis. But quieter. Elias was aware without looking that several people were listening. "You don't have to apologize to me," Elias said. "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm doing it." A small silence. "There were 11 or 12 other people in the bank," Aldrovandi said quietly, "who received some version of your warning over 3 weeks. Emails, phone calls, informal mentions. All of them moved on. All of them trusted the system." He shook his head. "Why didn't you?" Elias thought about this for a moment. Not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. Turning the question over as if he hadn't considered it before, which was not entirely true. "Because the system is made by people," he said finally. "And people miss things, especially when they stop expecting to be wrong." He paused. "I spend my nights alone with the numbers. Alone. No one to agree with me. No one to tell me I'm right. No one to check against. You have to learn to trust yourself completely, or you trust yourself not at all. There's no middle." He looked at the screen. "I've been alone with those numbers for 3 weeks. I knew I wasn't wrong." Aldrovandi looked at him for a long moment. "What do you need?" he said again. The same 4 words as before, but this time meaning something wider. The formal incident report was classified as a critical infrastructure event. The Singapore Financial Authority opened a full investigation. Raymond Chee's team spent 72 hours rebuilding the Sentinel architecture to close the authorization gap. And the 36 similar gaps they found, once they knew to look, scattered through the migration documentation like small ticking things no one had noticed. The financial press published nothing for 4 days, because the MAS had invoked emergency information protocols that prevented market disclosure until the full scope of the incident was understood and the remediation was verified. When the story broke, and it broke globally simultaneously, carried by every major financial outlet within the same 90-minute window on a Thursday morning, the headline read, "Meridian Pacific averts $14 billion shadow structure collapse." Regulatory review launched. Overnight auditor's 3-week investigation credited with preventing regional market crisis. The 14 billion figure was the revised exposure estimate produced by the MAS investigation, incorporating chain reaction projections for the correspondent banking networks that would have been impacted. 11.3 billion had been Elias's minimum. The full picture was larger. The story spread. The way stories about ordinary people who turned out to be extraordinary spread, not loudly at first, but persistently, with a specific gravity of something that resonates in people who know what it feels like to be ignored. On Monday morning at 8:40 a.m. Singapore time, Elias was not in the compliance annex. He was at a laptop, borrowed from a colleague, propped on the end table of a waiting room in a private hospital in Penang. He had flown in on Saturday. He had spent Sunday sitting with Mei Lin, watching cartoons, eating the curry puffs she liked from the hospital canteen, listening to her tell him in great detail about a story she was writing about a girl who could talk to fish. He had held her hand while she talked, and he had laughed at the right moments and the wrong moments, and she had told him he was laughing wrong, and he had agreed. The night before the surgery, he had stayed until visiting hours ended. Walking back to the small hotel 3 streets from the hospital in the warm Penang evening, with the smell of char kway teow drifting from a hawker stand on the corner, he had felt something he could not entirely name. A composite thing, made of exhaustion and relief, and a love so large it had no comfortable place to rest inside a single human chest. The financial assistance had come through. Aldrovandi had personally authorized an emergency employee welfare disbursement, a fund that existed in Meridian Pacific's HR framework and had, apparently, never been activated for a case like this before. Priya Subramaniam had signed the secondary approval within 4 hours of being asked. Elias had received the confirmation on Friday afternoon. He had sat at his kitchen table in Toa Payoh and read the confirmation email 3 times, and then closed his laptop very gently, as if he was afraid to disturb whatever had just happened. Now it was Monday morning. The laptop was connected to a hospital-provided Wi-Fi network that dropped every 12 minutes and reconnected after 17 seconds. Elias had learned its rhythm. At 9:04 a.m., the surgical team administrator sent him a link to the secure family livestream portal, a service the hospital offered for family members who could not be in the building during procedures. He clicked on it.
The screen showed a corridor, then a door, then a room, not the operating theater itself, which was never streamed, but a camera positioned in the family monitoring room, where a tablet showed vital signs in real time, and where the surgical nurse would provide periodic updates through an intercom system. The screen was small. The connection buffered for 3 seconds before stabilizing. He watched. At 9:12, the scrub nurse's voice came through the speaker to say that Mei Lin had gone under general anesthesia and the surgical team was proceeding. Her vitals were strong. She was stable. At 9:14, Elias Tan, senior night auditor, a man who had spent 3 weeks alone in a basement-adjacent office, watching for something no one else believed was there, a man who had been described by his CEO to 64,000 shareholders as an example of institutional anxiety, a man who had held himself together through every hour of the preceding 5 days, with the particular and visible discipline of someone who cannot afford to come apart, put his face in his hands. He did not cry immediately. He sat for a moment with his face in his hands and let the silence be what it was. Let the relief be what it was. Let the exhaustion be what it was. Then he wept. Quietly, the way people weep in waiting rooms, contained, private, without theater. The kind of weeping that is not grief but its opposite. The kind that comes when the thing you have been bracing for so long, with such total and consuming effort, begins, slowly, carefully, with the sound of a heart monitor and a scrub nurse's steady voice, to resolve towards something like safety. The MAS press conference was held on Thursday, 8 days after the incident, in a conference room in the financial district with the Meridian Pacific Board, the regulator's senior team, and, by prior arrangement, a live broadcast link to approximately 1,200 accredited financial journalists across the Asia-Pacific region and Europe. Crispin Aldrovandi stood at the podium in a charcoal suit with no tie. This was deliberate. The absence of the tie, which his communications director had suggested, and which he had accepted without comment, was a signal, small, readable to anyone who followed these things, that this was not a performance. That he was not here to manage the narrative, that he was, in some specific and structural sense, accountable. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the incident, its scope, its origin, its resolution. He described the failure of the Sentinel architecture and the remediation that was underway. He described the regulatory cooperation and the steps being taken to ensure that the authorization gap could never recur. And then he paused. Not the practiced pause of a man who has been coached to create dramatic beats, but the actual pause of a man who is about to say something that cost him something to decide to say. "I want to speak to something that I believe is more important than the technical details," he said. During the period preceding this incident, there was one person at Meridian Pacific who identified the threat. He identified it 3 weeks before it became a crisis. He documented it meticulously. He escalated it through every appropriate channel. And at multiple points, including in a live public broadcast that I hosted, he was dismissed. Not just ignored, but characterized, publicly, as an example of the kind of unfounded anxiety that modern automated systems are designed to prevent. The room was very quiet. That characterization was wrong. It was made by me without knowing what I was saying about a specific person, and it was broadcast to 64,000 shareholders, and it was incorrect in a way that goes beyond professional misjudgment. It was incorrect in a way that speaks to a failure of institutional culture, a culture that I built and that I am responsible for, that placed systemic confidence above human expertise, and that treated the judgment of a person as inferior to the output of a system that person had correctly identified as flawed. He looked into the camera, not performing, just looking. Elias Tan, our senior night auditor, found what our systems missed. He spent 3 weeks doing it alone, without authorization, without encouragement, on the overnight shift in an office that I have never visited. He prevented what my risk team calculates as a minimum $14 billion liquidity crisis that would have affected sovereign debt markets in at minimum 4 countries. He did this while managing a personal situation of extraordinary difficulty that I will not describe without his permission. And before he saved this institution, I mocked him in public for trying to warn me. There was, in the room, and presumably in the feeds of 1,200 journalists, a silence that was not empty but full. The silence of a large group of people processing something
That was not what they had expected to hear.